He was fired on a Monday morning, in front of 12 people, by a man who had already signed the paperwork 4 days earlier and simply waited for an audience. Charles Voss slid the termination notice across the table without introduction, without cause, and without hesitation. Then he added one sentence slowly, loud enough for everyone in that room to hear it clearly. "You're finished. And in this industry, no one will hire you again." Matthew Hale looked at the paper. He looked at Voss. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked out. What Voss did not know, what no one in that room knew, was that Matthew had already seen something nobody else wanted, and he was about to buy it. What did Matthew buy? The very thing Voss had once signed off on discarding. Keep listening. Charles Voss arrived at 8:03, flanked by 2 members of the executive team. He did not look at the report on the table. He did not look at the data Matthew had prepared. He looked at Matthew the way a man looks at a problem he has already decided to stop thinking about. He sat down, adjusted his cufflinks, and cleared his throat once before he spoke. He did not ask Matthew to present. He did not open the floor. He placed a single sheet of paper flat on the table and pushed it across the polished surface until it stopped in front of Matthew's hands. It was a termination notice, effective immediately, signed and dated the previous Thursday. Matthew looked at the paper. He read the words slowly, not because they were complicated, but because some part of him needed the extra seconds to understand that this had already been decided 4 days ago, before this morning, before the report, before the 8 minutes he had spent standing early in a hallway preparing what he was going to say. The room was quiet. Giselle Harmon sat at the far end of the table, a folder of financial projections in front of her. She did not speak. She did not move, but her right hand closed slowly around the edge of that folder, pressing it flat against the table until her knuckles went pale. Voss leaned back. His voice was calm, precise, carrying just enough volume to be heard by every person in that room. "You're finished, Matthew. And I'll be honest with you, in this industry, no one is going to hire you after this. Not now. Not in 5 years." He said it the way a man delivers a verdict, not a warning. Final. Sealed. Matthew looked at the termination notice one more time. Then he looked at Charles Voss. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He folded the paper once, placed it inside the cover of the 41-page report he had stayed up until 2 in the morning to write, and stood up from the table. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, buttoned the middle button, and walked out of the conference room without looking back. The packing took less than 30 minutes. 2 years of work fit into one standard moving box: a stapler, a framed photograph of Lucas at the beach, a small cactus someone had given him as a joke about resilience, and a USB drive with backup files. Security escorted him to the elevator with the practiced politeness of people who had done this before and would do it again. The lobby doors opened to a gray Tuesday sky, and Matthew Hale walked out of Corway Logistics with a cardboard box under one arm and his phone buzzing in his pocket. He answered without looking at the screen. "Dad," said the small voice on the other end. "What are we having for dinner tonight?" "I want the pasta with the round things." Matthew stopped on the sidewalk, adjusted the box. "Tortellini," he said. "Yeah, we can do that." The 3 weeks that followed had the particular quality of water draining slowly from a sink. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a steady, quiet disappearance of possibilities. Matthew sent his resume to 6 firms in the first 10 days. All 6 came back with variations of the same answer. The position had been filled, or the timing was not right, or they would keep his information on file. 2 of those responses came within 48 hours of submission, which meant someone had not actually read the resume. It meant someone had already made a call. He understood. Voss had not been making a prediction on that Monday morning. He had been announcing a plan already in motion. The savings account had enough to cover 4 months of rent and groceries, maybe 5 if he was careful. Lucas was starting 1st grade in September. The enrollment paperwork was sitting on the kitchen counter next to a permission slip for a school field trip to a farm. The field trip cost $12. Matthew signed it without hesitating and then sat at the kitchen table for a long time after Lucas had gone to bed. He opened his laptop not to look for jobs that night, but because sitting in silence made the apartment feel too large. He had a browser tab open. He was not sure when he had opened it, showing a listing aggregator for distressed industrial assets. He had looked at pages like this during his time at Corway, studying market gaps the way other people study crossword puzzles. It was something he did when he needed to think without the pressure of thinking. He scrolled without urgency. Most of what appeared were the usual entries: obsolete processing plants, flood-damaged storage facilities, a handful of properties that had been listed and relisted for years without resolution. He was about to close the tab when a listing near the bottom of the fourth page stopped him. Delray Industrial Park, 4.2 acres, legacy rail infrastructure, partial electrical systems, rated for heavy load capacity. Located 31 miles outside the city center. Listed for 3 years. Price reduced 4 times. Current asking price was a number that would have sounded absurd for a functioning facility and merely alarming for a gamble. The listing notes were brief. Unsuitable location, too distant from current distribution hubs, infrastructure in need of significant rehabilitation. Matthew pulled up a separate window and opened the Federal Corridor Planning database he had bookmarked 2 years earlier. During the Northern Expansion research, Corway had ultimately ignored. He found the updated projection map for the Eastern Logistics Corridor, the one that showed planned highway expansions and rail line upgrades scheduled to come online in the next 4 to 6 years. He placed the two maps side by side on his screen. Delray sat at the exact intersection of 2 lines Corway's analysts had not waited because the timeline was too long for a quarterly earnings conversation. In 4 years, maybe 5, that location would not be 31 miles from a distribution hub. It would be at the center of one. Matthew stared at the screen for a long time. He closed the laptop. He looked up at the ceiling in the dark. He thought about the 41-page report sitting in a box in his closet. He thought about the field trip permission slip on the counter. He thought about the word "finished," said in a room full of people who had written it down before he walked in. Then he thought about what it meant that a 4.2-acre logistics facility with rail infrastructure and heavy load capacity had been available for 3 years and nobody had bought it. He opened the laptop again. Benjamin Cole lived in a brownstone 15 minutes from downtown and had spent 32 years in industrial real estate before deciding, at 62, that he was done sitting in offices. Matthew had met him once at an infrastructure conference 4 years earlier, had kept his contact information in a file labeled "People Worth Knowing," and had never used it. He used it now. They met at a diner on a Wednesday morning. Benjamin was the kind of man who ordered black coffee, read the menu, even though he clearly already knew what he wanted, and said very little until he had something worth saying. Matthew laid out the Delray analysis on the table between the coffee cups, the location data, the corridor projections, the timeline, the current price. He did not ask for money. He asked for an honest assessment. Benjamin read in silence for several minutes. He looked at the map. He looked at the projection data. He set the papers down and looked at Matthew. "Who else has looked at this?" he asked. Nobody who understood what they were looking at. Benjamin picked up his coffee. He looked at the papers one more time, then at the window, then back at Matthew. "You know the infrastructure rehabilitation alone is going to eat most of what you have." "I know. And the timeline before this becomes what you think it becomes, is 3 to 5 years minimum. That's 3 to 5 years of carrying costs, thin margins on short-term tenants, and zero guarantee the corridor development happens on schedule. I know that too." Benjamin set down his cup. He said nothing for a moment. And in that silence, Matthew could hear the diner around them, the sound of plates, someone laughing near the window, the coffee machine running a cycle. Then Benjamin made a sound that was almost a laugh, and wasn't quite. "The price they're asking for that property," he said slowly, "is either a gift or a trap, depending on whether you know the difference between a bad location and a location that isn't ready yet. I think I know the difference. I believe you." Benjamin folded his hands on the table. "I'll put in as a minority partner, enough to cover the electrical rehabilitation and 6 months of operating reserve. You run everything." He paused. "But Matthew, if you're wrong about the corridor timeline, this hurts both of us." "If I'm wrong," Matthew said, "I'll own it." The closing happened on a Friday afternoon in a small notary office on the second floor of a building that smelled like carpet cleaner and old paper. The title transfer document was 14 pages. Matthew sat across from the seller's representative and signed where indicated, initialed where indicated, and did not rush. Lucas sat in a chair by the door, his feet not quite reaching the floor, drawing on the back of a blank sheet of paper the receptionist had given him. He was drawing a truck, large wheels, a long trailer, a driver in the cab who appeared to be wearing a cape. Matthew signed the last page and capped the pen. He looked at his son across the quiet room for a moment before standing. In the parking lot, Lucas looked up. "Did you buy the big warehouse, Dad?" "I bought something people gave up on," Matthew said. "We're going to find out if they were right to." Lucas considered this very seriously, the way 6-year-olds consider things that feel important. "What if they were right?" "Then I was wrong," Matthew said. "But I don't think I was." Lucas nodded once, tucked his drawing under his arm, and walked to the car. The 18 months that followed were not glamorous. They were work, the specific, unglamorous, grinding kind that has no audience and produces no obvious milestones for long stretches of time. Matthew hired a crew of 7. He paid them on time, every time, even in the months when doing so meant he ate dinner alone, at a folding table in the Delray site office instead of at home, because the site office was cheaper to sleep in some nights than the gas to commute back. The crew noticed. They stayed. They worked harder than the job required, because the man running the job treated them as if their time had value. The electrical systems came first 3 months of rewiring and panel replacement that cost more than the estimate and took longer than the schedule. Then the loading dock reinforcements. Then the rail connector inspection and partial replacement. Then the floor resurfacing in the main bay. Matthew did what he could himself and contracted what he couldn't. He learned things during that period that he had not known before: the specific way rail tie bolts corrode in high humidity environments, which suppliers could be trusted to deliver on a revised timeline, and which ones needed a deposit hold to stay honest, how to read a structural load report without a civil engineer translating it for him. By month 11, Delray had 3 active tenants, small and mid-sized companies that needed affordable regional transit staging. None of the 3 contracts were large. Taken together, they covered operating costs and a thin margin. It was not a victory. It was evidence. He received an email in month 13 from a former Corway colleague, someone who had kept in touch, carefully, through the kind of periodic check-ins that contain more information than they appear to. The email mentioned, in passing, that Corway had signed a northern expansion contract and was now looking for third-party logistics partners along the eastern corridor to support the rollout. Matthew read the email twice. He saved it in a folder he labeled Reference. He did not reply. He went back to reviewing load capacity projections for the second bay renovation. Benjamin came to the site in month 15. He walked the full perimeter without speaking, looked at the loading docks, checked the rail connector spur, stood in the center of the main bay, and turned in a slow circle, as if taking inventory of the space above his head. When he came back to where Matthew was standing, he said nothing for a moment. "I called you a crazy person when we first sat down," Benjamin said finally. "You did. I was being imprecise." He looked around the bay one more time. "You're not crazy. You're just operating on a timeline that makes everyone else uncomfortable." Giselle Harmon had been promoted to CFO at Corway 8 months after Matthew's departure. She was good at her job, disciplined, thorough, and precise in the way that made other people in the building either respect her or be quietly afraid of her, depending on what she had most recently found in their numbers. She had not thought about Matthew Hale in any sustained way in those 8 months. She had thought about the meeting. She thought about it occasionally, the way you think about something you watched happen, and chose not to interrupt, not with guilt exactly, but with the low-frequency awareness that a choice was made. When Voss assigned her to evaluate third-party logistics partners for the northern expansion rollout, she took the task seriously. She built a scoring framework. She identified 15 potential facilities. She sent her team to do preliminary assessments on the top 8. On a Tuesday afternoon, her assistant dropped a revised shortlist on her desk. Giselle scanned the names. Her pen stopped at the 4th entry. Delray Industrial Hub. Owner-operated. Single proprietor. Established 22 months ago. She turned to her computer. She looked up the business registration. She looked up the property transfer records. She sat very still for a moment, then pulled up the facility profile her assistant had attached. The numbers were solid. Rail access, heavy load rated, active tenants, competitive square footage costs. The location scoring was the highest of any facility on the Eastern Corridor for the expansion parameters she had specified. She closed the file and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she picked up her bag and told her assistant she would be conducting the next site visit personally. Delray on a Thursday morning was busier than she had expected. A delivery truck was backing into the second bay when she arrived. Two men in safety vests were running a forklift through the loading corridor. The site had the texture of a place that had been built by someone who intended to keep it not flipped, not staged, not prepared for a visit. Functional. Deliberate. She found Matthew near the north end of the main bay, standing in front of a logistics routing display mounted to the wall, speaking with a member of his crew. He was wearing a flannel shirt, work boots with dried concrete on the toe, and the particular expression of a man who is concentrating on something that matters to him. He looked up when he saw her. His face did not change. "Miss Harmon," he said. "I wasn't told to expect a visit. That was intentional," she said. "I prefer to see a facility the way it operates, not the way it presents." "That's a fair approach," he said. "Where do you want to start?" They walked the full facility for 40 minutes. Giselle asked technical questions, load weight tolerances, rail schedule coordination, electrical backup capacity, tenant conflict protocols. Matthew answered every question directly, without hesitation, without embellishment. He did not ask her what she was really doing there. He did not reference the conference room on the 24th floor. He acted as if this were a standard professional evaluation, because in his mind, that was all it needed to be. By the time they reached the final section, Giselle had filled 4 pages of her notepad. She stood near the exit and looked back at the facility one more time, as if checking her notes against what she was actually seeing. "You've built this in under 2 years, she said. Not a question. 22 months, Matthew said. She nodded once. They shook hands at the entrance. She walked to her car, placed her notepad on the passenger seat, and sat without starting the engine for almost a full minute. The facility was not just adequate, it was the best option she had evaluated, by a margin that was not particularly close. She tapped her fingers once against the steering wheel. Then she started the car. The report she submitted to Voss 3 days later placed Delray in the top-tier rated first among 7 finalists based on location scoring, infrastructure quality, and cost efficiency. She wrote the recommendation carefully and without editorial comment, letting the data carry the weight. She presented it to Voss on a Friday morning. He read until he reached the 4th line of the executive summary, where the facility name appeared. His expression did not change dramatically. It simply closed, the way a door closes when someone on the other side leans against it. He took a pen, drew a single horizontal line through the Delray entry, and set the report face down on his desk. "Find another provider," he said. Giselle had expected this. She had told herself on the drive in that she would not push, that she would accept the decision and move it through process. But looking at the line through the data she had gathered, she found she could not make herself say yes without asking the obvious question. "The recommendation is based on a scoring framework you approved in September," she said. "If there's a specific deficiency in the Delray evaluation, I'd like to address it." Voss looked at her with the particular patience of a man who is not actually patient. "My reason," he said, "is that I said no." She left his office. She sat at her desk and looked at the expanded corridor map on her screen, the same federal projection data that she had pulled 3 times since evaluating Delray, trying to understand why that location scored so strongly. She understood it now. She had understood it the moment she walked the facility and saw how the rail connector aligned with the planned line extensions. Matthew had bought a piece of land that was worth almost nothing in the present, and placed an extremely calculated bet that it would be worth a great deal in the near future. He had done that with his savings, after being fired in a room full of people who watched it happen, after being told by the man who fired him that he was finished. And he had been right. She picked up her phone. She looked at the number for a long time before she pressed it. Matthew answered on the second ring. "This is going to sound strange," Giselle said, "but I think you should know your facility may be removed from the Corway shortlist, not based on the evaluation, based on something else." There was a silence on the other end of the line. Not the silence of surprise, The silence of a man who is deciding whether the information changes anything. "Thank you for telling me," Matthew said. "You're not angry. Being angry doesn't change the information. The information does." Another pause. Giselle pressed the phone slightly harder against her ear. "What are you going to do with it?" "I'm not sure yet," Matthew said. "But I appreciate the call, Miss Harmon. I mean that." The call lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds. When it ended, Giselle set her phone on her desk and looked at the ceiling for a moment. She thought about the 41-page report that had been sitting on the conference table on a Monday morning 2 years ago. She thought about the way he had stood up and buttoned his jacket before walking out. She thought about what it meant to know something true and still choose not to say it. She thought about that for a while. Matthew opened his laptop after the call and pulled up the email address for Eleanor Marsh. Eleanor had been on the Corway board for 11 years. She was not a sympathetic figure in the conventional sense. She was direct, data-driven, and not particularly interested in what people felt about their situations. What she was, Matthew knew from 3 years of working alongside her on a restructuring project, was interested in numbers that told the truth. He did not write to her as a man who had been wronged. He wrote to her as an analyst who had identified a material risk to the company's expansion projections. He attached a 20-page document. No cover letter, no biography, just the data. The Nortec Supply Chain Group came to Delray without being invited. They had found the facility through infrastructure data, the same federal projection mapping that Matthew had used, cross-referenced against private investment scouting criteria. A team of 4 arrived on a Tuesday morning and spent 3 hours walking the property. They asked the same kind of questions Giselle had asked, and Matthew gave them the same kind of answers, complete, specific, and unhurried. The team lead was a woman named Diana Forsyth. She shook Matthew's hand at the end of the walkthrough and said she would be in touch by the end of the week. She was in touch by the following Wednesday with a letter of intent for a long-term regional anchoring contract. Matthew signed the letter of intent that afternoon. He took Lucas out for tortellini that evening, and when Lucas asked why they were celebrating, Matthew said they were not celebrating exactly, they were marking something. "What's the difference?" Lucas asked. "Celebrating is for when something's over," Matthew said. "Marking is for when something's starting." Lucas ate his pasta and thought about this. Meanwhile, inside Corway, Eleanor Marsh had read the document Matthew sent her. She had read it twice, then pulled the expansion projections from the third quarter board package and compared them line by line with the cost differential analysis Matthew had attached. The gap was real. $2.3 million annually in operating cost difference between using the optimal logistics partner and the next available alternative, a gap that would appear in 18 months and compound over time. She called Matthew's number. "You sent me a financial analysis," she said, "with no return address and no indication of what you want from it." "I wanted someone to have the correct data," Matthew said. "What happens after that isn't mine to decide." Eleanor held the phone for a moment. "You know this puts me in a difficult position. I know it gives you accurate information," he said. "What's difficult about that is a separate question." She called a board review. It was listed on the agenda as a strategic risk assessment for the Northern Corridor rollout. Voss was not consulted on the agenda items before the meeting notice went out. Then the thing that Matthew had not anticipated, and the thing that, in retrospect, made everything else possible, happened because of Voss's own certainty. Someone in the company began contacting journalists and logistics industry publications with sourced claims that Delray Industrial Hub had failed infrastructure inspections and that its owner had a documented pattern of misrepresenting credentials. The claims were false in every particular. They were traceable, through a communications vendor, to an account authorized internally at Corway. 2 of Matthew's smaller tenants received calls within 72 hours and quietly terminated their month-to-month arrangements rather than be associated with a public dispute. Matthew lost those 2 contracts in a single week. He sat in the site office the evening after the second notice arrived. He did not throw anything. He did not make calls he would need to walk back later. He sat at his desk and looked at the loading bay through the window, the systems he had designed, the floor he had resurfaced, the rail connector spur that ran clean and level from the facility to the main line. He had built this with his own money and 2 years of his life, and a number of nights he had not slept well. He called Benjamin. "They're coming after the reputation now," Matthew said. Benjamin was quiet for a moment. "How bad?" "Lost 2 tenants. The publications are running the story unchecked." "Can you trace it?" "Richard can," Matthew said. "That's why I'm calling him next." Richard Aldrin had the specific temperament of a lawyer who had seen many versions of this story and found none of them surprising. He listened to Matthew's account without interrupting, asked 3 clarifying questions, and said he needed 48 hours. In 36, he had traced the communications campaign to its source, a vendor account linked to an internal Corway authorization code. He documented it thoroughly, and then he called Matthew. "We have grounds for a defamation action," Richard said. "But that's not the play, is it?" "No," Matthew said. "The play is the board meeting." Richard pulled the threads together for Eleanor Marsh's review. Giselle, who had by this point decided that she was done asking herself whether to act, prepared a presentation for the board's strategic risk session that she had not cleared with Voss. She worked on it over a weekend, alone in her apartment, with the corridor maps and cost analysis spread across her kitchen table. On the morning of the board meeting, Voss sat at the head of the conference table with the assurance of a man who had managed rooms like this for 20 years. He had been told it was a standard review. He was not concerned. Eleanor opened the session. She invited Giselle to present the logistics partner evaluation. Giselle stood at the front of the room and walked through the scoring framework, first clean, methodical, the kind of presentation she could have given in her sleep. She showed the comparative analysis between the top 3 facilities. She showed where Delray ranked and why. She showed the projected annual cost differential, $2.3 million, between the top-ranked option and the alternative that was currently on track to be selected. Then she advanced to the second section of the presentation. The slide was simple. It showed a timeline. It showed the communications campaign. It showed the vendor account. It showed the authorization trail. "The decision to remove Delray from the shortlist," Giselle said, and her voice was steady and clear, "was not based on facility performance. It was not based on safety concerns or operational deficiencies. Those claims, now circulating in the press, are unsupported by any inspection record and originated from an internal authorization at this company." She paused. "The cost of that decision, in operational terms, is $2.3 million per year. The cost in legal exposure is something Mr. Aldrin can speak to if the board chooses." The room was quiet. Not the quiet of a room where nothing is happening, but the quiet of a room where everyone has stopped pretending something is not happening. Eleanor looked down the table. "Charles," she said, in the tone of someone who does not need to raise their voice to make a statement land, "is there anything you'd like to address?" Voss straightened in his chair. "The board does not run this company," he said. "I do." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "The board selects who runs this company," she said, "and the board reviews that selection when presented with material evidence of decision-making that exposes the company to financial and legal risk." She turned to the other members. "I'd like to call a procedural pause." Charles Voss was placed on administrative suspension pending an internal review that afternoon. It was processed quietly, the way these things are when the evidence makes argument pointless. He did not make a scene. He left the building at 4:17 in the same suit he had worn to the meeting. Nortec's contract with Delray was finalized the following Monday. It was a 3-year regional anchoring agreement, with 2 optional extension periods. The press release Nortec issued mentioned Delray by name and identified it as the anchor facility for the Eastern Corridor expansion. Within 10 days, Matthew received preliminary inquiries from 3 additional logistics operators. 2 of them were companies he had contacted 18 months earlier and been politely declined. He returned each call the same day he received it. He did not issue any public statement about Voss. He did not speak to any of the journalists who called. He had Richard send a brief factual correction to the publications that had run the defamation campaign, and then he returned to the work of running a growing facility. Giselle tendered her resignation from Corway 6 weeks after the board session. It was accepted without a counteroffer, which she had expected. She had spent the weeks between writing her own version of the conversation she needed to have with herself about what kind of work she wanted to do and what kind of person she wanted to do it for. The answer, when she finally let herself say it plainly, was not complicated. She reached out to Matthew by email, professionally, to let him know she was no longer with Corway and that she was available for independent consulting engagements. She was precise and brief in the way she was with everything, and she included a sentence at the end that had taken her longer to write than the rest of the email combined. She wrote that she was sorry she had not said something sooner. She did not elaborate. Matthew replied within an hour. He said he appreciated the email. He said he was expanding and that there were problems she might find interesting. He said she should come see the facility when she had a chance. She came on a Thursday morning, 6 months after the board session, on a day when the eastern light came across the loading bay in a way that made the new flooring look like it had been there for years. She was not there as an evaluator. She was not there to assess anything. She carried a cup of coffee and a folder under her arm, and she walked through the entrance with the ease of someone who had decided they were no longer a stranger to a place. Lucas was there because it was a school holiday and Matthew had no one else to watch him. He was sitting in the site office with a set of toy trucks arranged on the floor in what appeared to be a very deliberate pattern. He looked up when Giselle came in and studied her with the directness that only children who are not yet embarrassed by curiosity can manage. "Are you bringing Dad coffee?" he asked. "And some numbers," Giselle said. Lucas nodded, apparently satisfied with this. "Dad likes numbers," he said, and went back to his trucks. Matthew was standing at the desk with the Phase 2 expansion drawing spread in front of him, 4.2 additional acres on the adjacent parcel, an extended rail spur, a temperature-controlled secondary bay for pharmaceutical transit clients who had begun inquiring through Nortec's referral network. He looked up when she came in. He took the coffee she extended, and they stood side by side at the desk, looking at the drawings. "Phase 2 is bigger than the original," she said. "The original was proof of concept," Matthew said. "This is the actual plan." She looked at the drawings for a moment. "You had the actual plan when you signed the first contract." "Yes. You just couldn't say it out loud yet." Matthew looked at her. He said nothing, but the way he did not say it was its own answer. They worked through the folders she had brought for the next 2 hours: cost projections, tenant revenue modeling, corridor timeline updates from the Federal Infrastructure Office, a risk scenario she had built over the previous 2 weeks because the problem had interested her, and she had not been able to leave interesting problems alone since she was 19 years old. Matthew listened carefully, asked questions that went directly to the center of each issue, and made notes in the margins of her pages, in the particular shorthand of someone who has processed numbers in the field rather than in a conference room. Lucas appeared in the doorway at some point and announced that he was hungry. Giselle told him she had seen a sandwich truck parked 2 blocks down when she drove in. Lucas looked at his father, who looked at Giselle, and then Matthew said they should probably take a break anyway. They walked down the block in the afternoon light. Matthew and Giselle and Lucas, who walked between them and asked the sandwich truck driver a series of questions about the mechanical operation of the serving window that the driver answered with genuine patience. They ate standing on the sidewalk outside Delray, and the conversation moved away from numbers into other things, nothing consequential, nothing that needed to be recorded. Just the particular ease of people who have been through something and come out knowing what the other one is made of. Walking back to the site, Lucas reached up and took Matthew's hand, then reached up with his other hand toward Giselle. She looked down at him. He was already looking somewhere else, interested in something across the street. She took his hand without comment, and they walked the last half-block back to the entrance of Delray Industrial Hub that way. Inside the office, Matthew stood at the window that looked out over the loading bay. The Nortec trucks were running their afternoon cycle, arriving on schedule, loading on schedule, departing on schedule, down the access road toward the eastern corridor, where the federal construction equipment was already moving earth for the highway expansion that most of the industry had not yet incorporated into their projections. He had bought what nobody wanted. He had built it while everyone who had told him he was finished continued to believe that. The trucks pulled out of the bay in a clean line, one after another. Matthew watched them until they reached the main road and turned east, carrying the first load of the day toward the corridor he had been looking at on a screen in a dark apartment 2 years earlier, when the savings account had 4 months left and Lucas was asleep in the next room. and the only thing he had to work with was a map and an idea that everyone else had decided was not worth the trouble. He watched the last truck clear the gate, and then he turned back to the drawings on his desk and went back to work.